think about planning on three levels. One is just planning the general itinerary, the broad contours of the trip. Then there's the planning of how you get to that destination. And sometimes it's fairly straightforward. And then there's the micro level of planning of what you're going to do at the destination on an hourly basis or on a daily basis, right?
Yeah.
And this level of planning can be fairly straightforward for the snack type trip, and it can be very complex for the Michelin star trip. The earlier you plan, the better for the more high stakes trips, and you can get away with less planning for the smaller trips.
So we've all been there. We've planned a trip really well and gone to a wildlife destination. It's the best time of year to be there. And most stars are aligned in our favor, but still we come back with nothing to show for on our memory cards. And that's how it is in wildlife. Most of the time, it's very unpredictable. But that doesn't take away the importance of planning a trip well. And we have Sumeet, who's my very good friend. We've been friends for over 10 years now. Sumeet's a fantastic wildlife photographer. He posts on sumeetmoghe.com. I'll share the link in the video description. But apart from being a great photographer, Sumeet's a really, really good wildlife photography trip planner. He is a compulsive planner. At this moment, I'm a part of 2 of the trips he's planning. I don't know how many more he's planning, but I have benefited so much from Sumeet's meticulous wildlife trip planning that I thought it's good to discuss and hear from him what it takes to plan a wildlife photography well. Hi, Sumeet. Happy to have you here.
Happy to be here, mate. Good talking.
So, Sumeet, what is the last trip that you're on, and what's the next trip you're going to be on?
It's the one which we went on together. Your audience has probably seen the video by now. It was a trip we did to track down wolves in the vicinity of Pune, Baramati, and those areas. Good trip, huh?
Good trip, yes. And what's the next trip you're going to be on?
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? We did that really short weekend trip, which we squeezed in somehow. And now the next trip is one I've been planning for the last 2 years, which is to Botswana, where we are going to be out in the wilderness all by ourselves with no phone signal. It's kind of borderline scary, isn't it?
It is super scary, and I've been researching so much about that. And I think
You've been
the
researching all the things that can go wrong, right?
That can go wrong, yes, because somebody in the group needs to do that. So I think the Botswana trip is going to be a separate story in itself in terms of the amount of effort and the kind of planning that's going into it, including things like how much fuel for each day and so on and so forth, right? But when you think about something like that, which is a Botswana, which is like almost a couple of years in the planning, and something like Carbonwadi and Baramati and wolves, which is practically your backyard, right? How are these two different in terms of, I'm assuming one is easier to plan than the other, but how do you see the process of planning for these two trips?
Because I think I look at them as 2 ends of the spectrum, right? So the wolf trip over the weekend is almost like the snack that you can have anytime. And the Botswana trip, or a trip that you take abroad away from your country, is a bit like a Michelin star meal. And then there's every kind of trip in between, maybe the home cooked meal where you go away from your city. You probably take a flight or you drive and you go to a tiger reserve or a national park. And so all 3 are different. They come with different levels of emotional attachment, but they also come with different levels of planning, because the wolf trip, as you might remember, we just planned with a few days' notice because there's a local guide there. He called us and said, the sightings are great. Why don't you come over? And all we did was just, I remember just packing 1 lens, 1 camera, and some clothes, throwing it into a small bag, and then coming with you. And then there's the Botswana trip, which I've been salivating over, dreaming about, planning for 2 years now. And we're still planning, right? So there's a whole raft of, experiences that sit between those 2 extremes.
Absolutely. So what's a good example for a home cooked meal? Like what might be an example of that?
Yeah. So I think if you look at India, and a lot of people who are probably listening to this are in India, right? So a good analogy there would be, or a good example there would be going to a tiger park. Or even for somebody like me who's based in Pune, going to a place like the Run of Kutch, right? I can't do it on a whim, but I've done it enough times. A lot of people know about it, right? So there's a lot of experience in our own network to rely on as well. Uh, and the stakes are higher than the weekend trip, but lower than the Michelin star where you're going to have to
Yeah,
book flights in advance. You're going to spend a lot of money and all of that. And also, some level of planning can be a little ad hoc with that if you think of it, right? For example, let's say I don't have a certain kind of equipment that I want for that trip that I'm going to LRK for. Let's say I want a big 600 which I don't own. If I'm going there for 3 or 4 days, it's something that I can quickly rent and take with me, and it's not going to, you know, break the bank or anything. So there are many of those aspects that make the home cooked meal of trips a little easier than the Michelin star.
absolutely. I think in my experience also, given that LRK is something that we've done so many times in the past, I mean, it becomes a home cooked meal over a few sort of cooking sessions, right? In the sense that
Yeah.
the first time we went there, I think the first time I went there in 2012 was also with you, or maybe there was a second time. But then there was a little bit of a uh, preparedness going into what kind of places in LRK you want to spend time at, and so on and so forth. Some of these places we now know very well. So I think the familiarity with having been there so much also goes into making it like a home cooked meal, in the sense that it's very familiar. You know the process well, and you can experiment, and you're comfortable that even in short notices and so on and so forth, you can pull it off well, given that the ingredients are around.
Yeah, and you make a great point because it depends on where you are in this relationship with wildlife photography, right? So what might be my snack might be somebody else's Michelin star. And what might be my Michelin star, which is Botswana. Imagine somebody who stays
Yes.
in Botswana. For them, it's their snack, right?
Outside of the amount of time it takes to plan and the cost involved, any other big differences in these kind of trips, you think?
Yeah, I think there are differences in the kind of preparation that you need to do, right? So to a certain extent, if you think about the neighborhood trip that you're going to be doing, after a certain point of time, you can handle yourself in those kind of places. And it gradually will bring it down the level of preparedness you need to go with.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're going far from home, and oftentimes it's a trip of a lifetime, I don't imagine that there are people who are doing a trip to Botswana every single year. Very few of them.
Yeah.
So for somebody like me, it's probably going to be a trip of a lifetime. And in those cases, there's a level of preparedness you put in terms of studying about the place, figuring out what's the best season for you to go to have the most productive outcomes, figuring out also where you're going to stay, because something that a lot of wildlife photographers will appreciate is that location is key. You don't want to spend a lot of time getting
100%.
to the places that are productive. So where are you going to be staying? Where are you going to be camping? That's essential to the whole experience. If you're going to be moving around, what's going to make it easy for you to move around? Are you going to have to walk around a lot? Are you going to have to drive around a lot? And then are you going to need some expert guidance in a certain area? So, for example, certain areas are meant for guided tours, right? And some
Yeah.
areas are meant for you to handle by yourself. But at places which are meant for guided tours, you need the best kind of expertise, because what an expert guide does is they use their knowledge of that particular area where they live in and day out. They're seeing the behaviors of the animals day in and day out, and they make your stay productive for you, right? So all of those things combine to kind of give you the best experience possible and the most photography opportunities possible.
Absolutely. I'm also wondering if, does that mean that every time I'm planning to go to a new place, it automatically elevates in terms of complexity of planning because, I know nothing about the place. I will invariably rely on somebody's either secondary research or somebody there to show me around, because my own sense of that place is only based on what I've seen on social media and things like that. But what the habitat's like, what the weather's like, what timings are like, so on and so forth. Even though I might have read about it, it's always good to have a guide. So automatically, the first time you go to some place, it can never be a snack, so to say.
Yes and no. Uh, one one secret weapon you can always have by your side is time.
Sure.
Because let's say you don't know a place and you're still guiding yourself. If you have that secret weapon, then over a period of time you can get to know a habitat, right? So I remember when I went to the Kruger National Park, I spent 3 weeks there. And I didn't spread myself thin trying to complete the entire park. I just did the southern and central region. And what you'll realize is when you drive around one camp, you'll get to know the roots and the behaviors and the patterns of animals within a couple of days, right? And then after a certain point, you can start predicting what's likely to happen on which track, right?
Yeah.
So I would say if you're not getting a guide, then your secret weapon has to be time. You have to give yourself time.
Yeah.
But then there are certain destinations, regardless of how many times I've gone, I would never go without a guide. For the simple reason that things change so much that by the time I'm making my second or third trip, the animal behaviors have shifted, the tracks have shifted, the terrain has shifted. And so my knowledge is already outdated. One of the places which is like that is the Masai Mara, right? There are no tracks. So what do you go and look for?
And recency as well in Mara, right? I remember the last time I went there, just a couple of weeks before we went there, there was this leopard that was seen with the cub almost every day, a leopard with two cubs, in fact. And when we went there, it was not to be seen at all. And the guide came in so handy there in terms of letting us know to sort of temper our expectations accordingly. And he said that, I've heard that you've come here with this expectation, but over the last 2 days, she's moved into a thicker part of the jungle where she's not coming out on the side we can access. So let's not spend any time at all. So yeah, I think that's where like a really good guide can sort of come in handy, even if you have been to a place multiple times. And I think the Mara is one such place.
And certain places, are kind of designed for you to handle by yourself. Certain places are not. So, for example, if you look at a place like Etosha or a place like the Kruger National Park, they're designed for you to do by yourself. The tracks are well marked. You have books like this one, which can help you plan every single day at a very granular level. There are apps where people report sightings. There are Telegram and WhatsApp groups where people report sightings. So if you keep your eyes peeled, you have all the clues to find the wildlife that you need.
If you had to step back a little and let's say I'm sort of starting to think about a place I want to go to, what are some of the most important questions? How do I begin? And what's the first question I should ask myself? Or what's the first step in planning, so to say?
Yeah, I think with the trips that I'm planning right now, the question is, what am I expecting from that trip? There's a certain kind of experience that I'm expecting. And, even when two of us are going on the same trip, I can bet a fat chunk of change to say that your expectations are going to be different from my expectations, right? What I'm trying to get at is that your experience and the kind of thing that you're expecting from that trip often dictates the way you do the micro level planning of the trip, right? So, for example, if you are hoping to photograph a number of species, then you want to cover as much ground as possible, right? On the other hand, if you're looking to photograph only a particular behavior of a particular species, then it's a question of sticking with an animal and then planning the granular details to a certain extent where when can I get to that animal, where am I most likely to get to that animal, and when you find that animal, then you stick with it and you take that punt. Sometimes it doesn't pay off. Many times for the two of us it hasn't paid off, but when it pays off, the payoff is huge, right?
Yeah, I think, I think the expectation, and especially if you're traveling with a group, in terms of maybe 2 or 3 people who've planned it together, and it always makes sense to plan this in a group because of how expensive wildlife travel is. It's good to have not exactly a shared set of expectations, but some understanding on what the common expectations can be, right? It's good for us to all know what each other is keen on. Hopefully, it'll all be the same thing. But if it's not the same thing, it's good for us to have some kind of an understanding on where we're going to be prioritizing our time and things like that. For me, at a much more sort of meta level, it comes down to even having an understanding that wildlife is the priority on the trip is an important thing, right? Because often we've both been on trips where, we've been thinking that we need to spend all the time in the jungle, in the field, and even if it's high noon, we're okay to just wait it out and maybe wait for raptors and any reptile activity that might be there, etc. But the rest of the group has been keen to sort of rest and get lunch and so on and so forth. So I think for me, at a very fundamental level, even that understanding of a common expectation of what who wants on the trip and how much each person is sort of willing to put out there in the trip, if it's a group trip, is an important one. So that's a broader sense of common expectation. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and extend that to trips that you're doing with family, for example. Those expectations will change. So the dynamics of a trip that I do with you and other photographer friends is very different from the dynamic of a trip that I do with my children. Now, of course, I still make wildlife the priority when it's with my children because I want them to experience it the way I enjoy it. That's what I give to my children. But then I'm not so fussed about that one shot, right? I'm trying to ensure that the experience is a little more holistic for them and they're not getting too focused and too down about not getting the shot, right? Sometimes, that happens with photographers. You don't get the shot and then you're morose all throughout. And you don't want to have that kind of vibe with your children. So the dynamics of my trip with my children and my family is very different from the dynamics of my trip with friends. And it's just something to keep in mind.
There's this guide I met in Tadoba. You've probably traveled with him as well. And he was telling me that he's never seen a happy photographer in his entire life because we're always cribbing about the shots that we never got or that one shot we didn't make and not think about the rest of the things we saw there. So yeah, I tend to agree with him. So now that some amount of understanding of expectations have been put in place, and you sort of let's assume that it is a wildlife trip that I'm going on, and the objective is to get a certain kind of shot and see a certain kind of it's wrong to say the objective is to get a certain kind of shot. Let's say the objective is to see a certain kind of species and so on and so forth. What are the next things I sort of need to think about in terms of planning?
Yeah, if you have a guide, talk to your guide about what you want to do. And I don't know, what's your experience telling guides, I want to see an animal doing this? What does your guide usually say to you?
I think before you get to a place, they promise you that it's absolutely possible. And once you get there, you start hearing that, well, it happened last week. And this week is that one odd week in the year where it's not doing this. So yeah, it's typically what happens. But yeah, I hear your point on being in touch with the guy. That is important.
Yeah, in fact, even for a local trip, I usually call the guide to figure out what's happening. In fact, the local guides are usually my source of information to figure out even if it's worth going somewhere or not. And that's at almost every level, if you see, because whether it's the weekend trip or whether it's that home cooked meal that we were talking about, even, for example, when we are going to the Run of Kutch, we call and we try to find out if there are any active dens to photograph if you're looking for foxes.
Yeah.
Similarly, if I was planning a trip to a tiger reserve, which is, let's say, a summer trip, then my planning begins in winter. And it's only the guides who are out there in the forest in winter who can tell me, all right, there are these litters, these tigers active in these zones. So this is how it might be in April. Because remember, when you have to book Tiger Reserve permits, you do them many months in advance. So sitting in your cities, you're not going to be able to make the best guess, decisions. But if you ask people who are on the ground, you're likely to get better information, right?
It's also useful to, sorry, go ahead.
And then in certain cases, if the place affords you information on, let's say, a group or a channel, then subscribe to that channel if you expect to go there on a regular basis, right? So as I said, Kruger has this Telegram channel with sightings that get posted every day. So you get to see the patterns and make your decision that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say it's a good idea to keep an eye on social media. It's one of the few good examples of how social media can come in handy. You have a good sense. You have a good sense of the place. But again, what I gather is that there are various degrees of flexibility with every trip, right? If, for example, we're doing, say, something around Pune, like Satara, or like even where we went to, we always have the flexibility of, speaking to the guide the previous day and saying, what the wolves seen there this week at all? If they haven't, then you decide based on that information whether you're going to go there and still take a chance, assuming that they will show up today, or you decide to go somewhere else and take your chance. That flexibility exists. But with say a tiger park, like you mentioned, there is very little flexibility, right? So you have to sort of you sort of have to live with whatever is happening in the zones you booked in, and so on and so forth, right? I think that's also something to keep in mind. But it's still good to be in touch with a guide and have a conversation with them, even if it's a tiger park, just so that your expectations are in check and you're not in for a surprise. And it could be something as simple as what the weather is like. It could be something as simple as a certain, like, being prepared for a longer drive, or being prepared for going somewhere very far off, or just something like what the guide in Mara told me as soon as I went there, saying that the leopard's not there anymore. So, like, firstly you're a little bit disappointed, but then you're like, yeah, there's many other things to see. So that's a good way of thinking about it as well.
Yeah, and there's some micro level planning that you can do even after you've reached a destination, right? Because let's say you've reached the Western Ghats, and the Western Ghats is rich in biodiversity. So after you've reached that place, you can make micro level decisions of what am I going to do in this morning versus this afternoon versus at the night, and what am I going to do the next day, etc. And you might have a plan for the next day, but based on how situations have changed and news that you've heard from somewhere, you can change that plan at the micro level, right? So I would say where you have the flexibility to kind of flex your plan a little bit, always leave that flexibility. In fact, this is the rule I've followed wherever I've had the flexibility. Put off your decisions till the last responsible moment.
Yeah.
Because the more recent the information, the more useful it is in wildlife. Anything that happened 1 week prior is less useful than something that happened a few hours prior.
What about thinking on things like gear? I mean, we can't dive into the specifics of gear because each place you go to might require you to pick up something for that place. But at what point do you start thinking about what you put into your camera bag, or what you may need to buy or rent, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, it depends on the kind of trip. If it's a really quick trip, then of course you're thinking about it probably days or maybe even hours before the trip. If it's a trip that you've been planning for a long time, then you probably want to give it a little more thought. You want to start thinking maybe a month or a few weeks at least in advance. And the reason I say this is because let's say you're going to another country for a trip, right? It's going to be hard to rent gear in that country. If you've got to procure some gear, then you want to give yourself some time to get used to it. All of those considerations come into play. Sometimes you're going to have to do some DIY. So, for example, with the Komodo, you did some DIY with a monopod, which you were pushing towards the Komodo, right? So, trying out some of those experiments at home, it's the classic thing of sharpen your axe first. Don't go with a blunt axe. So, that's what you do at home. And I would say the higher the stakes of the trip, the earlier the preparation, the lower the stakes. You have the room to get something wrong. If I got something wrong with a weekend trip, I can do another weekend trip.
Sure.
But if I got something wrong with an international trip, it's hard for me to do that international trip again.
I think one place where some of this comes in really, really handy is that, and we probably do a separate video on how we should think about planning like a Milky Way shot. But specifically when you're doing like astrophotography, right? You pretty much know before you go there the visibility, barring cloudy nights and so on and so forth. You know from what time to what time the Milky Way is visible. But there is still an immense amount of planning that you need to do on the day when there is daylight for that shot, right? And you've done a fair bit of that, be it in Namibia or I think be it in Madagascar as well. I'm not sure if we did that there, but I remember some of your shots from Namibia, which are really, really mind-blowing.
Yeah, and I know you made it sound as if it's very obvious, but to a lot of new photographers, it isn't obvious. So they go to a place which is famous for its night sky, and they're like, where's the goddamn Milky Way? And the Milky Way is visible only on certain days, right? So you've got to go pick out an app that tells you that information. And that actually has to be planned when you plan your itinerary, because that's an itinerary level item. So first things first, is there sufficient Milky Way visibility? Because if it's anything less than an hour, you're wasting your time. It takes some time to set up, get your compositions, iterate through them till you get the actual shot, right? So anything less than an hour, it's pointless. Then once you've got to the place and you know that on that particular night, the Milky Way is going to be visible, then you can't go and fumble around with your equipment at night.
Yeah.
You've got to figure out your composition mostly during the day. So go around, scout. You've got to have everything sorted. You also need to know, okay, what am I going to carry? You've got to be very minimalistic with your gear at night.
Yeah.
Something falls, something breaks, you're going to stumble at that time. So the more you know your gear and the fewer things you have to manage, the better. So go set up your composition during the day. Once you've done that, then at night, it's just a matter of executing shot after shot after shot, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I absolutely love doing, because there's a method, there's a science to the whole thing. And there's a lot of technique involved in nailing those shots. So every shot feels like a little bit of a project, right? And compulsive planners like projects.
Yeah, I think I very distinctly remember 2013 when we'd been to LRK, and we decided that tonight's going to be an auspicious night for the Milky Way. I don't even think we saw an app or a calendar, but we just thought tonight's going to be a good night, and so we head out. And I remember fumbling with the equipment and so on and so forth. I think just for comparison, we should put some of those shots in contrast with maybe what you've done at Namibia and some of the other places. So yeah, we've also learned it by sort of fumbling in the dark with what to carry, what to shoot with, so on and so forth.
Hot tip for anyone who's listening to this: use Sun Surveyor or Sunseeker. Those are great apps for you to plan and ensure that your trip is happening around the times that you're looking for certain celestial events. The other celestial event that a lot of people look for, and maybe I can share the shot, is of a full moon really close to the horizon.
Yeah.
And that can make for great opportunities if you're lucky. So, for example, an animal silhouette right in front of the full moon. Not a very common event, but if it happens for you, that's golden.
All of these are things that you learn in some way or another by having erred at some place, right? And I remember when we'd been to Madagascar, there were at least a couple of days when we felt that we could have planned this better had we asked the right kind of questions, right? And that is something that we learned sort of retrospectively. Like, I remember us trekking up and down Izalo for a day and a half with with all of the equipment we were carrying, including laptops for some reason. And I remember then we exited the trek in like 20 minutes, though we trekked there up there for a day and a half, right? And there's been more examples like this where had we asked the right kind of questions to the guide before we embarked on the journey while we were there, or even before we started the journey, we could have sort of entirely not done that aspect of the Madagascar trip, been to another place, and so on and so forth. Beautiful as Zalo was. So, what are some of the questions that you think are really important that you need to sort of dig deep with your guide on to avoid some of these surprises, so to say?
Yeah, hindsight's always 2020. Sometimes, the most pointed questions don't give you the right answers. But I've found that visually showing your guide or your organizer what you're looking for, picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So you show them, these are the pictures I want to make. And they could be references of other people's work, and there's no harm in learning from other people. And they can tell you where it's most likely that you will make those images. And they'll also tell you when is the best time, right? Now, if I had to go to Isalu, I probably wouldn't go with all of that equipment. I probably would just go with a 24/7 frame and a tripod, and that's it. And I'd be a much happier person at the end of it. But I probably wouldn't go there at all. And I would go to another place and make some reptile images, right? So, but I hadn't shown those images, right? So what the person who was organizing our trip did is they organized what is a stock Madagascar trip.
Yeah.
A list of places where everyone likes to go. But we're not often everyone, right? Wildlife photographers, as you said, are a grumpy lot. So you need to optimize for that grumpy lot.
Yeah. I mean, the one learning I've had from that trip is that every time I see the word hike in the itinerary, I double check with them on what the photography opportunities there are. Because typically a hike is something that everyone likes to go on, but not if you're a wildlife photographer who's carrying like a few cameras and lenses and so on and so forth. And we also want to evaluate a hike based on the opportunities for photos it has. I'd much rather hike to a mountain from where I can get like a photo I like, as opposed to a hike, which everyone enjoys. So I think I've been asking every time I get a plan with a hike mentioned in it, I sort of, check on what we can do there, whether we can need to do that at all, whether we can replace it with something else or an easier hike and so on and so forth. So yeah, nothing against hikes. I really enjoy hiking, but not necessarily when I'm carrying my camera with me, right? So yeah.
I can't tell you how much I agree with this. I know there is this thing about the destination and the journey being just as beautiful, but I'm a shallow man. I enjoy my destinations. So if there is no payoff, don't take me on a big journey is my point.
Fair enough. And I think, again, on the trip to Izalo, right? And this is where sort of planning and thinking about what might come next could have really been helpful. I remember we spent a good half a day making a shot of the Outsility, or the longest chameleon in the world, because we thought, wow, we've seen the longest chameleon in the world. It's amazing, it's rare, and we spent so much time making beautiful shots of that. And once we did that, we saw it every other day in significantly better places and so on and so forth. And it turns out that it's one of the more common chameleons in Madagascar, and it's not something that we should sort of spend that much time on, right? And that's probably something that we could have planned for as well, in terms of which species is, so to say, easy to come across, which species are the rarer ones, and which species you want to sort of necessarily give time to so that you can see them, while there are other common species that you're going to see any which way.
Yeah, I mean, that particular chameleon, the Austerleti, which you're referring to, we'd studied quite a bit. You remember we were carrying a full-on field guide with us for the reptiles and mammals of Madagascar. The thing is, sometimes when you go to a place for the first time, everything is wondrous. Yeah. And the first time you see it, everything looks awesome. And then you see it all the time and you wonder why you spent so much time on it the first time round, right? But yeah, I think giving a little more thought to the kind of image that you want to make and how frequently you see a species helps you decide what amount of time you invest on that species. And then also you can think about which are the more difficult species to find and spend more time in those areas if those species are also your target species, right?
For sure. For
And
sure.
then there is another level, right? You and I kind of obsess over this sometimes, where it's not just about the species, it's also about the behavior of a species.
Yeah.
And then it's another level of planning. So what I would say is do as much studying as you possibly can. So, both of us own a ton of field guides. And I think those field guides, apart from being able to identify the animals, tell you a little bit about how common they are, where they're found, what their behavior is like. And that can help you plan a little bit, especially if you're going to a place for the first time.
And I understand that the second time or the third time you go to a place is probably when you make your best shots, but we really can't afford to go to Madagascar too many times, right? I understand that. I'll probably go
One more
there
time.
another time. Yeah, one more time, maybe. But then, there are some of these places which we're likely going to visit only once, and you want to make sure that you're still trying to make the most of it. That's where sort of I'm coming from. So I think it'll be interesting if we're also able to sort of maybe at a later point in time pull out some of the planning documents that we have for Botswana, most of which you've put together, and go over what it entails in terms of, because one thing about a Michelin star trip, like you mentioned, like Botswana, is that if you aren't planning one now, it's unlikely you'll be doing anything till mid 2024, because that's the horizon of time sort of to plan it, right? So even starting the planning and the various stages of planning that till the time you book your tickets is going to be an eye-opening process, at least for me, when I saw the way you had planned the whole thing was. And that's an important conversation as well. And maybe we could speak about that next in terms of how to exactly go planning for Botswana. But this has been super enlightening. This has been super helpful. Thank you for making time for this.
Hey, my pleasure. And before I leave, I must tell the viewers that when we say Michelin star, it doesn't mean we're living in luxury. It just means the amount of emotional investment we put into a trip. That's all. Because we've spoken about this upcoming Botswana trip. We're going to be sleeping on top of a car, living in that car, sleeping in an unfenced camp, and that kind of thing, and driving ourselves around. So there is no luxury in there. There is the emotional investment which we're referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thank you for making that point in case we sort of got someone to think that a Michelin star trip actually meant a very luxurious. And in fact, the most interesting Michelin star trips have been the one where we had the least amount of luxury, if I can say so. When we were in Kirindi in Madagascar, I remember a room full of geckos that we were in. That was quite something. Or if I had to think about say the Borneo trip, where we were living in a boat, or the other trip which I did to Komodo Islands by myself, that boat was the most simplistic, minimalist boat that I've seen. So yeah, I don't think a Michelin star necessarily refers to the comforts, though it means though we might end up spending just as much on it, but it's not necessarily comfortable.
Yeah, indeed. It's been a good chat, man.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you for taking time for this.